I have never encountered anyone in the royal family who behaved as improperly as Meghan Markle.
I remember we're in the car and driving up, and he said, "You know how to curtsy, right?" And I just thought it was a joke.
Those words came out of Sophie's mouth in a recent interview, and they completely tore apart the royal family. But she did not stop there. She dragged out secrets Meghan had spent years desperately burying.
I've had quite enough of Meghan. The truth is, she was shown the door for brazenly flirting with William, the future king.
The real reason Meghan hunted her way into the royal family. The deeply unsettling flirtation Meghan directed at William that left him recoiling in disgust. And the truth about why Meghan truly fled the royal family, a truth so ugly it shatters everything the public was told. Everything you thought you knew was a lie, and Sophie just blew the whole thing wide open. The woman who wore the wrong crown. On April 1st, 2026, an interview clip was rapidly spreading online like wildfire. Then, just as quickly, it started being deleted. But not before thousands had already seen it. In that clip, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had publicly accused Meghan Markle of improper conduct. People were desperate for it to be a joke. It had to be a joke. After all, it was April Fool's Day. Surely someone was playing a cruel prank on the nation. But then noon arrived, and a growing number of people were already swearing on everything they owned that they had seen the video with their own eyes, and that every second of it was terrifyingly real. Soon, rumors started flying around social media that a senior palace representative had released a public clarification stating that Sophie's views reflected the long-standing expectations of conduct within the royal family and the standards required to protect the integrity of the institution. The palace stood directly behind every word she said. Sophie was not alone in this fight. She had the full weight of the royal family behind her. The family had chosen her deliberately because she was the one person nobody could credibly dismiss as bitter or personally threatened. What Sophie said next completely shattered the Sussex story that millions of people thought they understood. Meghan, Sophie alleged, never truly wanted the Sussex title at all. Sussex was a consolation prize. What Meghan had actually been reaching for, from the very beginning, was the Princess of Wales title and the man who carried it. Sophie told the interviewer she had said to her husband Edward early on that something felt deeply wrong. Meghan was not trying to find her place in the family. She was positioning herself for a specific target within it. She was not looking at the role she had been given. She was staring at the throne beside her. The warning signs had been screaming long before anyone in the public even noticed them. In 2017, Meghan was still only Harry's girlfriend. No engagement had been announced. The palace had not cleared any public statement about the relationship whatsoever. Yet Meghan walked into a full interview with Vanity Fair, one of the most powerful publications on the planet, and confirmed the romance entirely on her own terms without telling Harry's communications team or informing the palace. Staff inside the institution were furious. They described it privately as her first unilateral act, a deliberate signal that she intended to operate outside every rule before she had even formally agreed to follow any of them. Then came the tiara war in the weeks before the May 2018 wedding, and the story most people know is nowhere close to the real one. Meghan wanted a specific tiara from the royal collection. The Queen's dresser, Angela Kelly, refused the request. Harry reportedly erupted at palace staff over the decision. What almost nobody reported was why the refusal happened. The tiara Meghan had chosen had a history. It was one of several pieces in the royal collection that had originally belonged to the Russian imperial family before the 1917 revolution destroyed them. When that world collapsed, the jewelry scattered across Europe. Some pieces were bought cleanly. Others passed through people who had fled Russia, carrying things that were not entirely theirs to carry. Because of that murky history, The palace had strict rules around those particular pieces. Anyone wearing them needed a completely clean security file. No gray areas, no open questions. The problem was that Meghan's security clearance was not fully signed off. Her background check had flagged unresolved questions around certain relationships and contacts she had built during her years working in Hollywood. Those connections had not been fully investigated or cleared. Until they were, that tiara was off the table. So while Harry was screaming at staff about a piece of jewelry, the actual reason it was being withheld was sitting in an unresolved security file with his future wife's name on it. He either did not know that or did not care. The household staff never forgot that moment. For many of them, it was the moment they understood exactly what was coming. But what happened before the wedding was only the beginning. What happened once Meghan was officially inside the family was far more calculated and disturbing than anything that came before it. What the cameras almost missed. When Sophie reached this part of the broadcast, something in her shifted. The warmth she had carried in her voice for the earlier portions of the interview cooled into something harder and more dangerous. She leaned slightly forward and said that Meghan's suspicious actions towards William was not a one-off. It was not a cultural misunderstanding between an American woman and a formal British institution. It was a pattern, she said. And it started in May of 2018, just 72 hours after Meghan married Harry and officially stepped into the royal family. Guests all around, Meghan greeted William with a lingering kiss on the cheek, and then held his forearm in a prolonged, firm grip that nobody in that room could explain away as ordinary. William's entire body stiffened. Senior staff standing nearby exchanged glances. The word that circulated internally afterward was alarm. A duchess who had been in the family for less than 3 days had already broken the most fundamental physical boundaries surrounding the man who would one day be king. 5 months later, at a mental health engagement at Buckingham Palace in October of 2018, Meghan placed her hand flat against William's back while talking to him. It was not a brush or an accident. It was a deliberate, flat-palmed contact on his back, the kind of physical gesture a person uses with their spouse or their parents, not their husband's brother at a formal royal event. William yanked his body away instantly. It was a silent and obvious rejection of a line that should never have been crossed. Sophie noted it at the time, and she remembered the way William's body had flinched, as if he had been burned. January of 2019 brought the Royal Foundation Forum, a public event where all 4 of them appeared together to discuss charitable work. The public saw unity, but Sophie saw something else entirely. Meghan had refused the pre-agreed seating plan for the panel, the standard royal arrangement that placed couples together, William beside Catherine and Harry beside Meghan. She pushed to sit directly next to William instead. During the event, she repeatedly cut across Catherine's speaking time to pull the media attention toward herself. Meghan had decided her celebrity status earned her equal footing with the future King and Queen of England, and she acted on that belief without hesitation or remorse. What the press completely missed was something that had happened even earlier, in July of 2018 at Wimbledon. Meghan attended the tournament, ordered security to physically block photographers from capturing her in a public space, and generated days of headlines about her privacy demands. That was the story everyone reported. What nobody reported was what happened inside the private box where Meghan was seated, a box that placed her physically close to members of William's circle. According to people who were present that day, Meghan spent a significant stretch of the afternoon directing her full energy and attention toward William across the seating arrangement, repeatedly working to pull him into direct eye contact and conversation, while Catherine sat at a different point in the same group. One person who was there described it as conspicuous in a way that made the room uncomfortable, and the people who witnessed it carried it with them for years. By March of 2021, the palace launched a formal internal HR review, and the bullying allegations against Meghan made international headlines. But Sophie revealed that the report went far deeper than bullying complaints from staff. It contained a documented log of boundary violations spanning years. There were records of late-night messages sent directly to senior royals, completely bypassing every official communication channel that existed. There were accounts of Meghan forcing physical contact on the Queen and Prince Charles at formal occasions in ways that multiple witnesses described as staged and performative rather than genuinely warm. And the most corrosive finding in the entire file was this: Meghan had been feeding private family conversations directly to American media contacts, using the intimate details of Windsor family life to build her public identity as the warm, emotionally open American against the cold and rigid British royals, while the people she was describing sat in rooms a corridor away from her. Sophie's summary of Meghan's actual objective was devastating. She was not trying to belong. She was trying to become the most powerful person in the room. Meghan wanted to be the star, and if she could not be the Queen, she was going to make the Queen's life unbearable. Then, in late 2018, Catherine did something that shattered the entire story the world had been told about her. She did not cry quietly in a palace corridor, and she did not confide in a friend over the phone. Catherine picked up a pen and filed a formal documented complaint against Meghan directly through a private channel to a senior household official. This was not a staff grievance processed through an HR system, and it was not handled by lawyers acting on her behalf. This was personal, with Catherine putting her own name on record and stating plainly that her sister-in-law's conduct toward her husband had gone too far and could no longer be tolerated without documentation. It never leaked, and it never reached a single journalist. The palace buried it with the kind of silence that only money and power can sustain indefinitely. But it did not disappear, and that is where the story turns savage. 3 years later, when the 2021 review tore through the household, that complaint was pulled back out and placed at the center of the process. Sources with direct knowledge of that review confirmed it was sitting right there, referenced and counted, with nowhere left to hide. Sophie did not reveal anything the palace had not already recorded. Catherine had already said it in writing, years before the world was allowed to hear it. William never gave Meghan an inch. His reserve held completely and without exception against every approach she made. Every gesture was answered with a step back. Every advance was met with professional distance that no amount of persistence could break through. And when it became completely clear that William was never going to move, the strategy did not stop. It changed direction. What came next was colder, more calculated, and far more destructive than anything that had come before, because this time the target was not William at all. It was the only person in the royal family that Meghan would easily get her fangs into. Locking the door, how Harry was taken. Sophie's voice dropped when she got to this part, but not for effect. She dropped it the way someone drops their voice when what they are about to say genuinely pains them. Sophie said Meghan knew everything. She knew about the terrible fate that befell Harry's mother. Meghan knew about the trauma that had been sitting unhealed inside him for over 2 decades. She knew what it had cost Harry to spend his entire life as the spare son in a family where birth order determines your entire existence. Meghan knew every wound, Sophie said, and she did not try to heal a single one of them. Instead, Meghan pressed on every wound she found and used the pain it produced to keep Harry exactly where she needed him. Hearing that said out loud, plainly and directly, on a live national broadcast, was one of the most disturbing moments in the entire 5-hour interview. By 2019, the campaign toward William had stalled permanently. So Meghan turned her full focus to Harry and began dismantling every relationship he had left. This did not happen in a single dramatic confrontation. It happened slowly, carefully, over months of small moves that each looked individually innocent. When William's office reached out to arrange time between the brothers, the responses came back the same way every time. Meghan said they were busy. Meghan felt they needed space. Message by message, request by request, Harry's direct line to his brother was severed. Two brothers who had walked together behind their mother's coffin when they were teenagers, who had leaned on each other through everything the family had put them through, eventually stopped speaking to each other directly. Sophie called it a psychological blockade, and the description was exact. Meghan positioned herself as the only person on Earth who truly understood Harry, and she spent that same time making sure he believed that everyone who had loved him before she arrived was secretly against him. She needed him completely isolated so that he had nowhere to turn except toward her. The christening of Archie in July of 2019 showed publicly how total that control had become. Meghan refused the proposed photographers and refused to name the godparents. Like that wasn't enough already. She refused to allow the constitutional transparency that royal births had required for generations, treating her son's place in the line of succession as a private family matter that the institution had no right to document. Sophie read that moment without any ambiguity at all. It was not a privacy preference. It was a declaration that the rules of the crown ended at Meghan's front door and would go no further than she permitted. Behind closed doors during this same period, Meghan was telling staff directly that her position as a duchess meant equality with Catherine, not hierarchy beneath her. She demanded the same security team, the same budget, and the same global platform. When palace officials denied those demands by pointing to constitutional laws that had governed the family for centuries, Meghan did not accept the explanation. She collected every refusal and every denial and stacked them into a narrative of persecution. She was being treated differently because of her race. She was being deliberately diminished. The victim architecture was being constructed brick by brick, and it was being constructed specifically to survive a global audience. When Sophie reached out to Meghan in 2020 and offered her personal guidance, it was a genuine act of generosity from a woman who had navigated the same terrifying transition from ordinary civilian life to royal duty. Sophie knew what it felt like. She had lived it. So she offered to share everything she had learned. Meghan's response was 3 words. "I have Harry," she said, and that was all she needed. Sophie did not hear those 3 words as a polite brush-off. She heard them as a declaration of total ownership. Meghan was not interested in learning how the institution worked. She was focused entirely on maintaining a complete monopoly over Harry's loyalty, with no outside voice capable of reaching him at all. Nobody outside the palace's innermost circle knew how bad things had already become. And what was happening behind closed legal doors was darker than the public negotiations anyone could see. It started with a lawsuit. In early 2020, Meghan had filed a legal case against the Mail on Sunday. The newspaper had published a handwritten letter she had written to her estranged father, Thomas Markle. Meghan said that publishing the letter was a violation of her privacy. On the surface, the case looked pretty straightforward between a woman protecting her private correspondence and a newspaper that had overstepped its boundaries. But underneath that clean surface, something dangerous was building. Every lawsuit has a discovery process. That is the stage where both sides are legally required to hand over documents, communications, and records. And the discovery process in this case had the power to expose something catastrophic for Meghan. It threatened to drag into open court the full history of every private communication she had maintained with British journalists and media contacts. The story Meghan had been building publicly was one of a defenseless woman hunted by a cruel and relentless media. The communications that discovery might surface told a very different story. Meghan's own lawyers understood the danger, so they quietly advised her to archive a large volume of those private media communications. The palace's legal team saw the exposure risk with equal clarity, but Harry had not been told any of this. According to people with direct knowledge of those conversations, he had been given only a simple version of events. He had been told the lawsuit was about protecting their privacy. What nobody told Harry was that it was also about protecting a paper trail that would have destroyed the story being carefully prepared for Oprah Winfrey's cameras. Now look at the letter itself, because the letter was not simply what it appeared to be. Before Meghan sent it to her father, Palace communications staff had reportedly seen a draft. At least one senior aide raised serious concerns. The concern was specific, and it was troubling. Certain passages in that letter appeared to have been written with two audiences in mind at the same time. The language was raw and painful enough to cut Thomas deeply on a personal level, but it was also measured and careful enough to read as the words of a wronged, heartbroken daughter if it ever became public. It was, in other words, a letter that worked privately as a weapon and publicly as a shield. Thomas gave the letter to the Mail on Sunday. The court ultimately found in Meghan's favor. But what the court proceedings also confirmed was something that could not be quietly dismissed. At the exact same time, Meghan was writing to her father about how unbearably painful it was to be misrepresented by the press. 5 of her closest friends were giving coordinated anonymous quotes to People magazine about the very same subject. It was not spontaneous. It was not coincidental. It was organized. A private letter expressing raw anguish to a father and a coordinated media operation aimed at shaping public sympathy were running side by side through the same hands at the same moment. Sophie did not directly reference the letter when she finally spoke publicly. She did not need to. She simply said that Meghan had taken a private family disagreement and rebranded it as a human rights violation. That letter was where the rebranding first began. The Oprah interview was where it went global. Sophie was direct about what the Oprah interview actually was. It was not a frightened woman finally finding the courage to speak. It was a deliberate commercial launch, and the brand being launched had been built entirely on damage done to the Windsor family. What made it worse was the timing. Sophie confirmed that she had personally contacted Meghan multiple times before that interview aired. She had offered a way through. She had opened a door, but every single approach was turned away without engagement. Then the interview was broadcast, and when it did, Prince Philip was lying in a hospital bed in cardiac care. He was 99 years old. The palace did not experience what they were watching as a family member's desperate cry for help. They experienced it as a calculated strike, timed specifically to land while the institution was at its most exposed and vulnerable. And it was not the first time that timing had been used as a weapon. The Sussex Netflix trailer had been released during Earthshot, one of William's flagship projects. Their holiday special had been scheduled to drop against Catherine's Christmas Carol concert. Every major piece of Sussex content had been aimed directly at a specific royal moment. The pattern never changed. The damage was never accidental. By the time the world watched Harry sitting on that lawn in California, something essential had gone from him. The man beside Meghan during that interview had been separated from his family. He had been cut off from every friendship and every relationship that had existed in his life before Meghan arrived. He had been handed a story to perform, a story he had not written himself, and he could not find his way out of it. The most disturbing part was that he believed every word he was saying. What neither Harry nor Meghan appeared to understand was simple. The institution they had spent years trying to destroy had survived far worse than anything they could bring to bear against it. It was still standing. They were not. And the full consequences of what they had done were only just beginning to reach them. The children, the crown, and the threat made before the summit. Sophie took a long breath before she made this next shocking revelation. She said the crown never demanded a DNA test. Then she stopped and let her words sink in. Sophie said that when people ask why the children's titles were not immediately proclaimed and publicly confirmed, the answer is one word: discretion. And within that family, she said, discretion means being sure, not just of biology, but of intention. The broadcast studio went completely still. Across the world, that clip tore through social media before Sophie had even finished the sentence. She had not used the word fraud. She had not accused anyone of lying directly. She had not needed to. The word discretion, placed inside that specific sentence, with that specific pause before and after it, was a grenade, and she had just pulled the pin in front of millions of people. To understand why those words exploded the way they did, you need to understand what constitutional transparency actually means inside the royal family. For centuries, births connected to the royal line of succession have required the institution to formally document and publicly verify the lineage of those who may one day carry it. This is not a formality. It is a constitutional function with centuries of legal weight behind it. When Meghan refused that transparency for both Archie and Lilibet, she did not simply make a lifestyle choice about privacy. She refused to allow the institution to perform a function it had carried out without exception for generations. Meghan created a void where documentation should have been. And the suspicion that filled that void was not invented by hostile journalists or a prejudiced public. It was created by the person who was a bona fide member of the family. You cannot weaponize the system and then demand its privileges. The titles of Archie and Lilibet were conditional on a relationship of transparency with the crown. Meghan had shattered that relationship, so the titles had not automatically followed. What happened at the Sandringham summit in January of 2020 had never been publicly reported, and it is the darkest moment in this entire story. The summit was a crisis meeting. Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles, Prince William, and Prince Harry sat down together to negotiate the terms of what would become the Sussex exit from royal duties. It was already a devastating occasion for the family, but before the formal session even began, Harry pulled his father aside for a private exchange. According to sources referenced in royal biography research and corroborated by separate palace accounts, Harry told Charles in that private conversation that if Meghan's full terms were not met, meaning the retention of their royal titles, independent financial operation outside the palace, and continued publicly funded security, then Meghan had told him she would give an interview to a major American outlet that would be far worse than anything the family had yet faced. Harry delivered that warning to his own father on behalf of his wife, who was not even in the building. Charles reportedly went silent for a long moment afterward. Then he looked at his son and asked him one question. He asked whether Meghan even understood what she was threatening. Harry had no answer. The Queen was briefed on that exchange before the formal negotiations began. People with direct knowledge of what happened that day have said that private conversation was the moment Elizabeth's view of Meghan shifted from deeply complicated to completely and permanently irreversible. The Sandringham summit is remembered publicly as a painful family negotiation. But inside those walls, it was the moment the institution understood with total clarity that it was not managing a difficult daughter-in-law. It was being held at gunpoint by one. Then came the summer of 2022, and what the Sussex operation did during those months was something that left palace staff genuinely breathless with anger. Queen Elizabeth was 96 years old. Her health had been declining for months, and her public appearances had nearly stopped. The country understood, quietly and with great sorrow, that the end of a 70-year reign was around the corner, and was prepared to say goodbye to the woman who had defined the institution for 7 decades. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's legal team were busy filing trademark applications in the United States for a brand called Royal Globe. The filings covered media production, podcasting, lifestyle content, and educational material across a sweeping range of commercial categories. Trademark applications of that scale require months of legal preparation and strategic planning to complete. So while Elizabeth was dying, the Sussex team was filing paperwork to sell the royal identity that Meghan had spent 2 years publicly dismantling. Sources inside Buckingham Palace described the internal reaction as among the most profoundly disrespectful acts they had witnessed from the Sussex team across its entire existence. The Queen died on September the 8th, 2022. The trademark filings had been submitted weeks before her body was cold. The commercialization of the monarchy's grief had been planned and legally executed while its matriarch was still breathing. Charles issued his private directive by late 2024, and it was not ambiguous. There would be no second Sandringham summit, no carefully arranged public reunion, no olive branch extended in any direction. Sophie delivered the conclusion without a flicker of hesitation. The door was not just locked, she said, it had been built over. Harry's ongoing legal campaign for publicly funded armed security landed against that backdrop and looked even more extraordinary for it. By early 2024, he was pursuing legal arrangements to purchase access to British police protection through private payment while simultaneously holding no royal duties, performing no public service, and living permanently in California. Sophie was not gentle about what that demand represented. She said it was dangerous because it set a precedent that British state protection is available for purchase by anyone with a royal title, regardless of whether they serve the British public in any capacity whatsoever. She compared it directly to Prince Andrew, and the comparison was deliberately devastating. Andrew had lost his protection when his public role was stripped away. The king had made clear there were no exceptions and no negotiations. Harry wanted the shield, Sophie said, without ever picking up the sword. But how wrong was he? Because the royal family is doing just fine without him and Meghan, so much so that their absence feels more like a blessing than a curse. The crown endures. Catherine, the institution, and what was left behind. As Sophie finished speaking, a single image came up on screen behind her. Catherine, Princess of Wales, standing beside King Charles at Sandringham. She was not performing anything. She was simply present, calm, and completely settled in the place she had chosen, and the role she had built. Sophie had just spent 5 hours explaining the difference between a woman who treated the monarchy as a launching pad for a personal brand and a woman who treated it as the purpose of her life. The image needed no caption. Sophie's elevation of Catherine throughout the broadcast was not personal flattery. It was an argument about institutional survival, made concrete through the contrast between two women who had entered the same world and made completely opposite choices about what to do inside it. Catherine, Sophie said, understood from her very first day that the crown is a marathon, and that every year of unglamorous, unbroadcast service is a deposit into something that pays out over generations, not quarterly earnings reports. While Meghan arrived demanding to set the terms of her own engagement with the institution, Catherine spent years learning its pace and requirements without complaint. Sophie pointed to a specific moment from late 2025 that captured the entire dynamic in a single example. When Catherine announced her Together at Christmas concert, a national event built around community and quiet service, Meghan's team in California moved their Netflix holiday special to broadcast in the exact same window. Sophie identified it immediately as the identical playbook that had been running for years without variation. The Oprah interview timed to Philip's hospitalization. The Netflix documentary trailer dropped during Earthshot. The holiday content that was scheduled against the Christmas Carol service. The strategy had never changed and had never been subtle. Catherine's concert pulled 8.4 million viewers. Meghan's special did not crack the top 10 in the United Kingdom. The audience had made their judgment and delivered it without being asked. By late 2025, the numbers existing across every measurable category told the full story with brutal efficiency. Catherine's favorability in the United Kingdom stood at 73%. William's stood at 69%. Meghan's had collapsed to 17%. Spotify had ended its relationship with the Sussexes entirely. Netflix had pulled back its financial commitment significantly. Archewell Foundation donations had fallen by 40%. The Royal Glow lifestyle operation Meghan had attempted to construct after the Oprah interview had found no sustainable audience because its entire premise was built on a contradiction that the public saw through immediately. You cannot publicly destroy an institution, call it racist and cruel to its core, and then attempt to bottle and sell the warmth and prestige that institution generates. The audience understood the hypocrisy even when Meghan appeared not to. Sophie said it plainly. You cannot leave a family, call it toxic, and then try to sell the Royal Glow as merchandise. The world is not that easily fooled. The palace's choice to remain silent through Spare, through the Netflix series, through every public attack the Sussex operation had launched over 5 years, had been a deliberate and calculated strategy grounded in a deep understanding of how performative conflict actually sustains itself. To engage with someone whose entire public identity depends on having a powerful adversary is to give them the oxygen they need to keep burning. Charles and William had chosen instead to let the work respond. State visits, community engagements, the Together at Christmas concert, the patient, consistent accumulation of genuine public service that no production company can manufacture because it requires years of real commitment to produce. Sophie said they did not sue and they did not denounce. They simply closed the door and kept walking. She said the Sussexes were now exiles with style guides. They had titles. They had no role, no institutional budget, and most critically, no influence over anything that actually mattered within the life of the crown. Sophie's final argument was the one that reframed the entire era. The Sussex disruption had not fractured the